Welcome Classic Rock fans to another ranking video, a worst to best, where we look to evaluate the albums by the most iconic of artists. And today we're hoping to bring some order to the chaos that is The Who. Before we start though, I will urge you to click like, subscribe and do all that stuff, and do check some of the links below this video for ways you can support the sterling work done here at Classic Album Review. Become a Patreon, why not? There's a fine body of work on there now. Anyway, enough of this flim-flam, let's get straight into it, shall we? Number 12 is Face Dancers from 1981. This isn't a bad album, it's just somewhat mediocre for a band that took us on that amazing journey from those early testosterone-fueled mod anthems to the more conceptually engaging pieces that were played as the sun shone, as did the music, resplendently over Yazga's farm in 1969. Don't Let Go the Coat, the Ode to Meher Baba, and You Bet You Bet are decent numbers, but musically it all seems rather pallid to me. There's no roaring guitars, heavy drums, or that swamp thick bass line that bludgeoned us at the University of Leeds in 1970. Townsend's songs on this album as ever are graceful and introspective, but I have to say that Daltrey seems rather uninvested, perhaps sonically not really ever recovering from the loss of Keith Moon. Pete Townshend told Jonathan Aiken in 1967 that a pop singer's life is well-paid murder. I think what we're witnessing on some of these later albums is the slow, strangulated gasp of Who-ness. The Who as a band set out to express the joy and the rage of a generation, but on this album it feels like their fox has been, if not shot, certainly stamped upon by the hobnailed boots and nihilistic roar of the punk insurgents. Oh, those phlegmy upstarts. This album is also interesting historically because it's the first album to feature Faces alumni Kenny Jones, which caused some rifts in the band. Roger Daltrey wasn't happy with Kenny Jones' drumming style. He went on to say that Kenny Jones is a fine drummer for the Faces, but wasn't right for the Who. In fact, if I may quote from his autobiography, Kenny watered down the energy of the band. He was pulling the Who back into a straight-paced Small Faces pub-style performance, and I was finding it impossible to phrase the lyrics. And I must admit, I agree with Daltrey on this. The Who sounds disappointingly tame with Kenny Jones on the drums. I miss all that shrapnel-induced chaos represented by Keith Moon as he contributed to the cacophony of this beautiful noise. Townshend, of course, has a completely different angle on it. He states in his autobiography that I like the novelty of playing with Kenny, who kept the beat without decorating it. Like me, John was finding more space in the Who's new sound, not less. Anyway, this album, Face Dancers, comes in at number 12. Number 11 is The Who, It's Hard from 1982. After the rather tame Face Dancers, I think this album rocks a little harder, which is certainly welcomed. And it's an album that spawns a couple of singles, Athena and Eminence Front. Sonically, this album is interesting as they explore the new synth technology available to them. This album in some ways reminds me of 1978's Who Are You, an album where they toyed with Moog and organ sounds. This incorporates, again, synths and some interesting keyboard. And they kind of fall between two stools on this album. First is the need to very much sound like The Who, and the second is to sound very modern and contemporary. But the band by this time are beginning to look like old relics, especially amid a musical landscape defined by the heroin chic of the 1980s New Romantics. The Who, at their very best, embraced that outrage and impulse of their generation, often straddling that fine line between music and sheer bloody noise. But this album overall doesn't feel quite right. Pete Townshend states that Daltrey didn't feel that the album was complete and insisted that Glyn Johns allowed them to work on it further. And even Glyn Johns insisted that they go with the first take of Eminence Front, although Pete Townshend felt that he could have sung it better. Townshend does go on to say that Daltrey's voice on One Life's Enough is one of his best vocal performances. Although Daltrey goes on to say in his autobiography that this album doesn't in any way stand up to The Who's early material. Number 10 is Endless Wire from 2006. This is the band's first studio album since 1982's It's Hard, and it opens with this synth riff that strongly recalls Barbara O'Reilly. The first half of this record very much feels like an artifact, replete with, in the words of The Guardian, preachy, creaky, acoustic numbers. It has to be said that the absence of Moon and Entwistle on this record is absolutely palpable. I personally don't think the Who ever really recovered from the loss of Entwistle. And on the second half we get Pete Townshend's new rock opera, and it all sounds pretty damn good, I have to say. Endless Wire often harkens back to previous Who albums. There's the whole thing at times feels like an exercise in nostalgia. Barbara O'Reilly haunts fragments, and the triplets on the Punk Meets the Godfather very much infuses Mike Post theme. Also, there's lots of stark acoustic introspection, which could be very much reminiscent of the Who by Numbers. The album does close with that mini rock opera, Wire and Glass, which Townshend has gone on to say that this song is based on the very first experiments by Lawrence Ball, a composer I commissioned to create a system and software that would recreate method music. Well, clearly an accessible piece then. Nevertheless, the closing suite does have a certain lineage to it, which recalls Pete Townshend's 1993 solo album, Psychoderelict, as well as the aborted Lifehouse project. According to Roger Daltrey in his autobiography, the song "You Stand By Me" was Pete's way of thanking him for backing him up and standing by him during all those dreadful child porn allegations. He goes on to say, "He handed me the demo tape and said, 'I wrote this for you.'" Anyway, number 10, The Endless Wire from 2006. Number 9 is Who Are You from 1978. This is the last album of Keith Moon, of course, but this album feels depleted. It lacks power. It lacks moonness is what it lacks. But then Keith had been suffering from dreadful ill health, I think at the time, and his drumming was definitely suffering. There was a fatigue and world weariness about the band as a whole, I think, on this album that led to the collective vision of the group somewhat waning. And the material on this album flip-flops between the blustery attempts at contemporary relevance, songs like Sister Disco, New Song, Music Must Change, and that bittersweet insecurity that we'd come to expect from Townshend. Wonderful numbers like Love Is Coming Down and the anthemic title track. I think it's safe to say that since Who by Numbers there's been a desire to drive the band into producing shorter, punchier songs and rockier albums, much in the vein of Who's Next, rather than the long, sprawling conceptual pieces. And the arrangements on this album rely heavily on synths and strings, which makes the tracks seem rather busy, cluttered in fact. Some of the tracks on this album, like the title track and Love Is Coming Down, explores often the contradictions in the life and presentation of ageing rockers, which makes them rather interesting. And let's not forget, in the autumn of '78, Keith Moon passed away, and effectively ODing on the medication that was prescribed to him to actually cure his alcoholism. Pete Townsend said after Keith Moon died that it made me lose all logic. Number 8 is The Who from 2019. This album has been described by Rolling Stone as hard rock comfort food. There's certainly a harkening back to a celebration, if you like, of The Who's back catalogue. The lyrics are gorgeously cynical, and they snarl through them. Lines like, "I don't care, I know you're going to hate this song." And Daltrey sings surprisingly well on this, with conviction and anger and snarl. I think he thinks he's back in 1965. And "I Don't Mind" on this album, the opening line is, "I don't mind other guys ripping off my song," as Townshend recalls one of the most anthemic Who numbers of all, "The Kids Are Alright." This album has been described as a sort of Abbott and Costello appropriation of the Who brand. Instead of the Who sell out, Who's Next, Who Are You, and so on, we just get The Who. And the cover is done by Peter Blake, that godfather of pop art, who's most renowned, of course, for Sgt. Pepper, as well as the Face Dancers LP. He was responsible for that one as well. But what we get is this wonderful, almost postmodern, perhaps even cynical depiction of popular culture through, people like things like the Union Jack on there, Chuck Berry, Pete Townsend smashing his guitar. My God, they were the days, weren't they? Batman and Robin, which is linked with the history of the Who as well. But it works effectively in terms of anchoring this album with a more glorious past, shall we say. I must admit, this album's a lot better than I expected it to be. One of the songs, I Don't Want to Get Wise, feels like a distant cousin, a few times removed perhaps to My Generation, especially when Daltrey sings it. Rather than the arrogance of Hope I Die Before I Get Old, Townsend now is writing lyrics more appropriate to somebody as gnarled as he is. Lyrics like Life Teaches Us Well, but I Don't Want to Get Wise. So anyway, I put The Who 2019 at number 8. Number 7 is a quick one from 1966. This is a wonderful conflation of pop and chaos. It lacks that sense of adrenaline and youthful rebellion we got with My Generation, and overall the album feels a little bit more muddled. Nevertheless, they had set their sights on more ambitious horizons, shall we say, with interesting compositions, complex melodies and lyrical themes. Not to mention the genre-defining A Quick One While He's Away, the mini-opera. Townsend in his biography says about this time he was struck by Purcell's use of unique, luxurious use of suspensions, a staple part of that Baroque decoration. He goes on to say that the first time I used suspension successfully is in The Kids Are All Right, mostly to suggest a Baroque mood. And Keith Moon lays down a solid mark with Cobwebs and Strange, while Townsend continues to write songs very much in that R&B vein, songs like Run, Run, Run and So Sad About Us. Well, John Entwistle also contributes to a couple of numbers on this as well, Whiskey Man and Boris the Spider. Boris the Spider would very much be in the Who's set list right up to the point where he died. A Quick One is a mixed bag of experimental musings and clutter, perhaps, that doesn't quite work for me, but nevertheless, it's the sound of the band's future being forged, I believe, especially, as I said, in the aforementioned mini-opera. I find Batman quite intriguing on this, as there seems to be a motif of a lot of groups appropriating the Batman theme, or Batman as a theme, for songs around about 1966, which was about the year that the TV show came out, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, for example, there was The Ballad of Batman by the Camps, the Spotlights did Batman and Robin, Dickie Goodman, Batman and His Grandmother, which was bloody awful. The finest one, of course, is the Batarang by the Avengers, a band that actually hails from Memphis. It's beautifully swirly and psychedelic. There are even those that suggest that Taxman by the Beatles was partly informed by the Batman theme. And the band at this time released Substitute, a song that takes its musical refrain from the contemporary British single Where Is My Girl by Rob Storm and the Whispers. Townsend describes Substitute as a homage to Smokey Robinson and the Miracles via 19th Nervous Breakdown by the Rolling Stones. Anyway, number 7 is a quick one from 1966. Number 6 is The Who by Numbers from 1975. This is an astonishing album, described by NME as Townsend's suicide note. This is Daltrey's favourite album, understandably so, because his vocal performance on this record is absolutely wonderful, full of rage, power and pathos. Townsend has said her trademark Daltrey bellow can communicate so much emotion, from withering sadness, self-pity, loneliness, to the more obvious rage, frustration, joy and triumph. This album often gets a bad rap for not being Quadrophenia. The songs are shorter and punchier. It seems people didn't want more concise and rockier numbers drawn from the mist of Townsend's drug and alcohol abuse. And understandably, therefore, it is quite a raw and emotionally exposed album. Daltrey has said of this one, how many friends and however much I booze expose our vulnerabilities, and the album is wonderful for that. It's about our inability in the bigger sense. One of my favourite songs on this album is How Many Friends Have I Really Got? It just aches with a sense of loneliness and pain. Very much about the idea of being marooned by fame in some respects. Daltrey has actually resurrected this number for his current live solo tour. Townsend's lyrics on her are very poignant, very personal, that making this album a deeply confessional affair. You know, tracks like Slip Kid, Success Story, Blue, Red and Grey, However Much I Booze, Imagine a Man, making it a truly exceptional release, I think. Number 5 is My Generation from 1965. The Who cut their teeth essentially playing R&B numbers, either as the detours or the high numbers, and Daltrey gave such songs a real urban street swagger. And the mods loved things like Tamla Motown simply for that reason, that it was an urban manifestation, an urban expression. Zoot Suit was recorded by the High Numbers at this point. It was actually written by their manager, Peter Meaden, but it was essentially a rip-off or copy of the song Misery by the Dynamics. There are a few seismic moments that very much affect the evolution of The Who, and one of those seismic moments was a support slot with Johnny Kidd and the Pirates. Now, Johnny Kidd and the Pirates were a real powerhouse, drums, bass, lead guitar, and Pete Townsend wanted to emulate that. Effectively, Roger Daltrey hangs up his acoustic guitar, just focuses on the microphone and that voice, leaving the other band members to create their own brand of mayhem behind him. And another seismic event was them supporting the Rolling Stones in 1963, where Pete Townsend says he stole the windmilling arm from Keith Richards. June 1964 marked the debut of The Who, when they played their first show at the Railway Hotel in Harrow, West London. It was about this time as well that Pete Townsend was becoming increasingly interested in the work of Gustav Metzger and his ideas of auto-destructive art. Of course, that would affect or influence that cacophonous melee that often ended the Who shows. Now, when Jeff Beck smashes his guitar in Blow Up, it's because of his frustration at the fact that the instrument is malfunctioning. When Townsend smashes his guitar, it's to create a specific and very special kind of noise. Can't Explain comes out about this time. Can't Explain, according to Townsend, it was a song that he wanted to be as much like the Kinks as possible. However, Daltrey dismissed it as a bit of pop ephemera, and he said he didn't want to sing anything so anodyne ever again. However, Anyway, Anyhow, Anywhere was considered a complete genius by Daltrey. In fact, the feedback on that song was quite revolutionary in many respects. Decca sent the first pressings back, feeling that there was a fault with the pressing, but as Daltrey has said, it was actually they'd effectively captured the band's live sound on vinyl. John Lee Hooker's stuttering blues was also an influence, and Roger Daltrey had been experimenting with his voice and stuttering in particular ever since they'd been joined on stage by Sonny Boy Williamson. Sonny Boy Williamson used to use a stutter rhythmically when he sang. I think Daltrey was taken at the kind of oral dissonance that this created. It became a stuttered articulation of youthful dissatisfaction. And one of the things that marks this album is that iconic cover photograph. The cover photograph was appropriately urban, as one can imagine. The photograph was taken at Surrey Docks, southeast London, November 1965. It was done by the Decca in-house photographer at that time was David Wedgbury. My Generation is an explosive debut with powerful guitars and drums, exhilarating chord crunches and distortions, which very much contribute to the overall sound of this album, of this band. Townsend's original numbers on here focus on melodic hooks and some real mod swagger. Tracks like The Good's Gone, Much Too Much, and of course The Kids Are Alright being some quality tunage. My Generation has been seen as an ultimate rebellious anthem. In fact, I think Townsend told Rolling Stone magazine in 1985 that it's essentially a song about trying to find one's place in society. It was actually re-recorded for the Ready Steady Who EP in 1966, where they incorporated at the end of it Elgar's Land of Hope and Glory. Of course, there had to be a writing credit on that to Townsend and Elgar. And it's also worth mentioning, one can't deny the influence of Mose Allison's Young Man's Blues as an inspiration, I think, for this one. This song demonstrates the clear influence of American R&B with that call and response thing going on. And the lyrics have been described by one critic as one of the most distilled statements of youthful rebellion in rock history. Number 4 is The Who, Sell Out from 1967. This album sees a wonderful appropriation of pop art motifs and the carnivalesque. But But 1966 was a fine year for music, with Blonde on Blonde, Frank Zappa's first album with the Mothers, Pet Sounds, and of course the Beatles' Revolver. Pete Townsend said Sgt. Pepper and Pet Sounds went on to redefine popular music in the 20th century. Atmosphere, essence, shadow and romance were combined in ways that could be discovered again and again. And let's not forget, quite interestingly, that Keith Moon believed that Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite was written about him. The Who, with this album, have produced this wonderful polemic on the very nature of the relationship between money, commerce and art. In fact, one critic has written that Townsend and The Who had come realistically to reckon with the powers of commercial machinery to outflank their best efforts at creative independence, yet had found a way to figure that state of ambivalence and contradiction within a vividly convincing musical and visual statement. The original idea or central conceit was the whole thing was going to be presented as like a pirate radio show, and they would sell space on the album for advertising, have these advertising jingles. Eventually they abandoned the idea of actually selling that to legitimate companies to actually creating their own advertising jingles. What we get, ironically, is a piece of very consumable, psychedelic pop confection that is incredibly dark in places. A lot of these half concepts at the time just tend to break down halfway through. The Beatles' Sgt. Pepper being another example, perhaps. Pet Sounds, there's an argument for Pet Sounds being a concept album. However, I feel that the fly in the ointment of the concept argument tends to be Sloop John B. This album also spawns arguably The Who's greatest ever single, and that was I Can See for Miles. I love all that dark, acid-drenched stuff. Also, there's wonderful songs in this album like Amenia City in the Sky, Relax, I Can Reach You. Also finds Townsend's writing reaching from almost quasi-spiritual territory, which would see him develop that idea for Tommy. Rael is another fascinating number on this album, another mini-opera. Some of the sonic motifs used in Rael would be repeated for their next album. This album was a wonderful symbiosis, a kind of a melding of where the band have been and definitely where they're going. A fusing of melodic, mod, pop, powerful instrumentation. Number 3 is Tommy from 1969. This full-blown rock opera about a deaf, dumb and blind boy who ultimately becomes analogous, or a metaphor if you like, for the spiritual blinkeredness and blindness of a whole population. This is the album that launched this band to the superstardom. I mean, arguably the plot is certainly a bit sketchy, but nevertheless you can't argue in terms of its power and conviction. Pete Townsend introduces this album to the assembled press at Ronnie Scott's in 1969 as a story about a boy who witnesses a murder and becomes deaf, dumb and blind, and he's then later raped by his uncle and gets turned onto LSD. Anyway, I'm not going to say too much about this album, as I've already done quite an extensive and detailed review on it. You'll find the card for this review just up there. Number 2 is Quadrophenia from 1973. Early Who thrived on that flash and outrage, which was faithfully represented in their stage show, but eventually, of course, they developed an interest in exploring more conceptual and complex pieces. Quadrophenia isn't a straight narrative, but rather a distorted dream view. Townsend has said that Quadrophenia was going to be a complicated, audacious project. I planned to emulate Walter Carlos's Sonic Seasonings album with extraordinary soundscapes between tracks. I wanted to capture the raging sea in quadraphonic sound. This album is built around the story of a young mod's struggle, a coming-of-age story. Many have said that it's more ambitious than Tommy. It's certainly less muddled and doesn't wallow in fantasy and sort of faux spiritual quest, but instead draws upon the band's own early experiences growing up, as well as the birth of mod culture. Townsend wanted to portray the story of Jimmy, the befuddled mod, having a kind of a four-way split personality, which many see as analogous to the 4 personalities in the band. But ultimately it yielded some fabulous music, some great songs in this one. The Real Me, of course, which was covered by Blackie Lawless and his crew back in the 80s, as well as songs like The Punk Meets the Godfather, I'm One, and the absolutely sublime Love Rain O'er Me. Townsend's writing on this is arresting and heartfelt, and the production is absolutely fabulous. Number 1 is Who's Next from 1971. Apart from live at Leeds, this band has never sounded so loud and so unhinged as they do on this record. Wonderful juxtapositions. We get ballads like The Song Is Over, and of course the tortured Behind Blue Eyes. We also get numbers like Bargain, my personal favourite, and Won't Get Fooled Again, which positively express the rage, anger and frustration and pain and passion of a generation, a beautiful anarchy buried in noise. Townsend develops a keen interest in synthesizers on this album, which further broadens the Who palette, and are used moderately and effectively. One commentator has said of this album that it represents the death of the 1960s, or the death of the 1960s ideal, where Townsend declares the song is over, scorns the teenage wasteland, and bitterly declares that we won't get fooled again. In the documentary about the Monterey Pop Festival, Townsend dismisses the counterculture as nothing more than an expression of youthful idealism and drug-fueled hope. And I wonder if some of that anger is channeled into this album. Keith Moon is completely unleashed on this record and has never sounded so unhinged. Daltrey sounds fantastic. And John Entwistle's bass lines are just absolutely manic. We might argue that Tommy, Quadrophenia and the Aborted Lifehouse Project are art, whereas this is nothing more than sheer unadulterated rock and roll. The Who's next read the Who's finest. Of course, this comes about from the aforementioned Aborted Lifehouse Project. This was going to be the next big Townsend opus. It was based on this dystopian landscape where the Earth's ecosystem has collapsed, and we all have to live in these little pods and have a virtual experience of the world pumped in. We'd all be subjected to a kind of a police state and have to endure long periods of hibernation, very much like the Matrix, I guess. Those that controlled the grid and controlled what experiences we had would ultimately go on to ban rock and roll as something that was dangerous and subversive, a theme that's been well furrowed and explored since then. But ultimately a group of renegades would hack into the grid, and people would be drawn into the Lifehouse, where each person would sing their own unique song to produce the music of the spheres, a sublime harmony that would become what Pete Townshend has called the one perfect note, before disappearing into a musical nirvana and mysticism of sound. The conclusion of the story was partly based on a book by Inyat Khan, a musician who became a spiritual teacher. Gosh, I have no idea why this just didn't take off. Townsend said in his autobiography that he ditched it because people had trouble coming to terms with the one perfect note idea of the concept, and it was ditched in favour of a collection of unrelated numbers, turning what George Mellet would call a revolt into style. Anyway, that's my ranking of the Who albums. Let me know what you think and how you would rank these albums in the boxes below. Anyway, if you've watched to this point, I want to thank you for doing just that, and maybe take some time to check some of the links below this video for ways you can support the fantastic work done at this channel. I'll leave it there and hope that you're well, staying safe, COVID-free, but more importantly that you keep listening.